I was just waiting outside the plenary hall to go in, and she came up to me, Bella Fitzpatrick. So I had used a different name to get in. She addressed me by Roisin, so I knew the gig was up. And then she started talking to me, and she seemed to think that I was going to start abusing the participants in some way or something. And I tried to reassure her, and I said, oh, no, I come to these things all the time. I don't ever even really talk to anyone. And she said, well, we know about you. We know about your journalism. And I said, it's really nice to actually see you and to talk to you. And I would love if we could go and have a chat and talk about this properly. Like, all I want to do is to talk to people like you, but people like you never answer my emails. And she was like, absolutely no way. And then to reassure her, I was like, don't worry, I'm not going to upset anyone. I talk to people all the time in and out of the cult. And then the word cult, her ears wiggled. And then I said, I speak to boys all the time who are sort of caught up in this, whether they're, an autogynephilic men, cross-dressers, transvestite. And she was like, okay, that's it. You've broken our code of conduct, of hateful conduct. You're out. And I was just like, what? And she was like, you're out. Get out. So I was like, shit, I'm getting kicked out. I had lost 2 days of work for this because I had to take 2 days off. I spent all this money on flights and now I have to get out. So when I said the word cult and I said the words autogynephile and transvestite, she was like, oh, you've broken the hate speech law. You're out now. And I was like, that's the kind of world that they're trying to construct. I've just been kicked out of a conference for my beliefs. I do wonder what I should do about it, considering that it's like taxpayer money,
Hello and welcome to Gender Looper. Today we're joined by Roisin Michaud, who's a Brussels-based journalist who tracks the activities of the gender identity movement and its adversaries all over Europe. We're going to talk today about a conference that we both went to recently in Barcelona. This is a bit of a different episode of Gender Looper because this is also going to be released on Roisin's really great Substack called Peaked. So you might be listening to this on the regular Gender Looper Substack, or you might be listening to it on Roisin's Substack. So whichever one you're on, go and subscribe to the other one. They both have free options. Mine is completely free. And so welcome to Gender Looper, Roisin.
Hi, Annette. How's it going? Thanks for having me on. And indeed, my Substack is also free, so go over there and subscribe. No commitment to pay.
I find you get a lot more listeners and readers than you do actual subscribers. And Substack is fine. You just put your email in there. You will not get any spam. You just subscribe. In my case, it's a podcast. In your case, it's podcasts and writing, covering all kinds of gender topics related to Europe. And Gender Looper is trying to cover gender in Spain, but in English.
What does lupa mean, actually?
Lupa means magnifying glass in Spanish. So it's really, I think that's all we need to do is just have a good look at it, almost like shine a light on it, have a good look at it. And I always feel like that should be enough to just show people what's happening. So I always start by asking my guests the same question. Your Substack is called Peaked. And we talk about peaked in this world as that kind of moment that you realized that all of this is something to be concerned about. So was there a moment that piqued you, or was it more of a gradual awakening?
I think it was a slow boil for me, honestly. I think I was starting to notice little things related to what we now call woke, but nobody was calling woke back then. And I've probably given a different answer to this question in various places. And it's honestly because I can't really pinpoint anything, but one major anti-awakening I had was this James Damore memo. Do you remember that? Do you know that story about what happened with him?
Was that the Google guy?
Yeah. Because I was working at the time in a job in communications in science, and it was all women. And I remember often thinking to myself, like, oh yeah, a lot of women are drawn to communications jobs for various reasons. And then when I heard about his drama, he was saying, yeah, a lot of like autists, males are drawn to programming jobs, and that sort of seems to be like a natural tendency. But he got absolutely demonized for it. And I remember there were points being made at the time as well about how sometimes maybe because the fact that women don't advance to top CEO of the world is because, you know, we take a big break in the middle to have babies. And that's actually at the stage of my life I was at. My kids were very small and I was very happy to work less and not put, like, you know, not dedicate myself too much, not breaking my arse basically to work, and to sort of find work-life balance. And I was like, yeah, that's one of the reasons why women might, you know, fall behind essentially. But I found that there was this other narrative that was taking hold that I didn't quite agree with. And also, I was working in science communication and we had these campaigns about getting women into STEM, and every single one of them ignored the fact that you can't, you know, fuck off and do a PhD and in your childbearing years and then also be able to, you know what I mean? So there was all this sort of contradictions that I noticed. And so I started to get a little bit red-pilled gradually. And then the gender thing came along and I was like, what is this nonsense? And I didn't say anything for ages. But then there was a woman who you probably know. Her name is Andrea Noabre. She's a TERF on Twitter.
Yep.
She's great. She writes books about feminism. And one day I was walking through a train station in my neighborhood and I saw in French, because I live in a French-speaking city in Brussels, it said, est-ce que vous avez plus de 65 ans? Est-ce que vous avez un cervix? Are you older than 65 and do you have a cervix? And I live in a really sort of a neighborhood where there's a lot of poor people. And I'm not sure that they would know what a cervix is, and maybe not in French. And I just thought, well, that's fucking stupid. So I decided to reach out to Andrea Noabre. So I was like, hey, I've had enough of this, and I see that you're a major TERF. And then it was from then on that I just started tweeting about it. And then I think in the beginning, I was maybe a very polite TERF, and then I got quickly radicalized by what I found. Voila. That's it. That was probably around between 2018 and 2022. And then in 2022, I went to Let Women Speak. Actually, sorry to keep going on, but it's true that in the beginning, I said to myself, nobody's telling the story of TERFs, first of all, and nobody's telling the story of the mothers whose daughters are wanting to cut off their breasts and stuff. So I started pitching those stories to like parenting magazines and weekend supplement editors and saying, you know, here's a new angle, because it's very difficult when you're a freelance writer. It's very difficult to find an angle. And I was like, whoa, here's a huge thing that nobody's talking about. And then you start, you know, not only like, you know, usually you send a pitch for a story and they politely decline or they ignore you, whatever. But the response to this was really cold. I knew there was something about this story that people didn't want told. So I thought, well, you know what, there's an opportunity for me. So the first thing I did was I took a Flixbus, which is one of these cheap, horrible buses that, you know, all over Europe. And I took one to London. And I went to this Brighton Let Women Speak event, and I got there, and it was like a Hieronymus Bosch painting. Like, I don't know if you remember the Brighton Let Women Speak event. It was absolutely bananas. It was before we were properly getting separated by barriers and stuff, so it was just an absolute pile-on. And I thought, this is a huge story. And I noticed that there were people sort of gathering around. My plan was only to write about the TERF movement at that point, but I think I fully got baptized as a TERF that weekend. But there were people gathering all around this crazy mosh pit of madness and saying, one guy said to me, I heard about Alison Bailey and I'm just interested, but I'm too scared to go into the crowd. And somebody else was saying, like, yeah, I heard they're putting men in women's prisons and all this stuff. So I knew the people around it who were passers-by, who were watching from a distance, were very interested, but they were way too scared to go in. So I was just like, this is a huge story, you know? So that's how and then I started Peaked, my newsletter, and yeah, people seem quite interested in it.
Yeah. Oh, well, you're a great writer. That's why your
Thank you.
Substack does well, because you have a really sharp turn of phrase sometimes. In fact, some of the pieces I've read of yours that you've co-authored with somebody else, you know, there'll be a certain line and I'm like, that was definitely Roisin. Yeah, it's a mystery, isn't it? And, you know, that it is such a story. And yet you get this kind of cold reaction, like people just don't want to go there. And the time has come now to talk about it. It's much easier now than it was before.
I think we're right at the inflection point, yeah.
So most of the work that you do is about the sort of European level of politics. And on Gender Looper, I mostly talk about Spain, that's the idea, but the stuff doesn't just arise spontaneously from individual countries. And I think since Brexit, I just put all of that European stuff out of my mind. And I think a lot of people don't really know how that whole ecosystem works, how there's the EU, there's the Council of Europe, there's all the NGOs and a kind of funding roundabout. Can you give us a kind of bird's eye view of that whole ecosystem?
Yeah, so there are essentially, I think, if you can't get laws passed or policies introduced in your country domestically, you might go to a higher power, so to speak. You might go to one of the unions or bodies or organizations or treaties or conventions that your country has signed on to, and then you can kind of go and say, you've signed on to the Council of Europe's XYZ on LGBTQ rights and you agreed to that. So, I'm going to use that to put pressure on my government to get what I want. And I think this is just standard sort of advocacy stuff. So we might say, for example, the UN has a convention on the rights of the child, an anti-torture convention, a treaty on this, they've all these agreements, and you might find that your country's government, you're asking them to do something and they're like, that's not a priority. But then you can go and you can point at, well, you're a member of this organization or you've signed on to that treaty, so you actually are obliged to do it. So you sort of use it to beat them over the head with, and that's just standard stuff. Because countries sign on to these international agreements, and I think there's a mix of, like, for example, if you want to join the Council of Europe, you have to do XYZ. And so if Albania, Montenegro, whatever these countries are, if they want to be in the Council of Europe, which confers certain benefits, then they will have to sign on to certain things. They'll have to reach certain milestones and sign certain conventions and agreements and treaties before they're allowed in. And then once you've signed it, then activists in Albania and Montenegro, whatever, are going to say to their governments, well, you signed this and these are the rights that we're demanding. And in fact, you've already committed to it when you signed that thing in Strasbourg. So that's just sort of standard international advocacy work. The European Union and the Council of Europe are two very different things. Well, not completely different, but they're two separate entities, and people get that confused a bit. And I think that works in their favour, because a lot of British people particularly think, oh, well, we're not in the EU, so that doesn't concern us. And also, there's all sorts of other countries who think they're not concerned by these sort of European level rules and policies because they think, oh, well, we're not in the EU. But a lot of countries are in the Council of Europe that are not in the EU. So the EU has 27 countries. Council of Europe has 47, I think. I think they kicked Russia out, so there might be 46. But basically, the EU was originally conceived as sort of a free market sort of idea where all countries can trade with each other as if they're borderless. Like, the idea was to make it like a, borderless.
One market.
Exactly. Very simple. And then that requires the free movement of people also for jobs. So that's why myself and yourself are able to move around in Europe, and capital also. So that was the idea. But then, if you're a clever activist, you can sort of say, well, and I went into more depth with this with Alessandra Astoriti a month or two ago. So that's also on my podcast. But you can sort of say, like, look, I want to be able to move to another country with my gay married husband or wife because that's where the jobs are, and that's the promise of the EU single market. But I can't because there's no gay marriage recognised in the country I want to go to. Therefore, and this is the key word, we need to harmonise the laws across the EU. Like, the EU is a great project, and I really am happy that my country, Ireland, is involved in EU, but they get more and more involved in sort of social policy, and I think not a lot of people agree with it. And I think it was all well and good until this trans nonsense came along, and then suddenly you're having, like, recommendations and strategies come up from the EU which say that, comprehensive sexuality education, which is inclusive of gender identity nonsense. We don't want any of that. Most people don't want that, and I think it threatens the EU project in general. So I think they really need to stop that. The Council of Europe, on the other hand, is not based in Brussels and has nothing to do with the EU. It's a completely different thing, and it's more of a human rights, rule of law sort of entity. So the 46 countries, they sign on to be members of the Council of Europe. It was established after the wars to sort of be like, let's, never again type stuff. And they are very much involved in all the social stuff because it's human rights as opposed to trade and economy and stuff. And the Council of Europe does a lot of stuff behind the scenes that issue like recommendations and things, and they're not necessarily binding, but it's an interesting question how these things get enforced and what sort of political pressure is put on behind the scenes to make countries adopt certain things that come from the Council of Europe. So for the good example is this, what happened with Rwanda. So didn't Boris Johnson have a plan to send all illegal immigrants or irregular migrants,
asylum seekers
to Rwanda, but then somebody goes to the court that's associated with the Council of Europe, which is European Court of Human Rights, and they find out that's against their human rights. So, I mean, if you're a good lawyer, not any comment on that policy in particular, but if you're a good lawyer, you can make anything about human rights. That's a conclusion I've come to. Like, you can having no fees to use a bank is a human right. Like, being able to podcast for free as a human right. Like, like I see just really imaginative things. I live in Brussels. So Brussels is the home of lobbyists. So you have like thousands and thousands of people whose whole job is to try to figure out how we can use whatever the EU has put out as like binding legislation, or whatever the Council of Europe has put out as like, very influential but non-binding rules and regs, and how I can use them to advance my cause, whatever it might happen to be. And we as TERFs will also sort of do that as well. Our rights as women, or as our rights to privacy or sports or whatever. So those are the two entities in Europe. But then you've also got the UN, and the UN is kind of the big one. The UN also has all these conventions and the treaties and stuff. And again, the activists will, if I go to Dublin and I say to my government, I want all sports to be desexed, and they say, absolutely no way, that's very unpopular here, we weren't elected for that. Then I go and I look at what Strasbourg, the Council of Europe, has produced, what Europe has produced in Brussels, what the UN has produced in Geneva, and I try and figure out a way that I can use what my country has signed up to. And then I go back to my minister and I say, hey, you know that you signed up to this. So that's sort of how it works. In terms of the worst aspects of gender identity nonsense are self-ID and gender medicine for kids, and also, let's say, sports and prisons. And a lot of those fall outside of what the EU is technically able to legislate on, but it hasn't stopped the activists trying. But they're busy in the background all the time. And the worst thing is that they're able to do this because they get grants from those very same organizations to do so. The EU will put out a call saying, we want civil society organizations to make sure we uphold the rights and the needs of the LGBTIQ community, or the whatever community. And then all these activists then will go and they'll get $500,000 from the European Commission, and then they'll use it to lobby the Commission to do what they want. And this big scandal was revealed recently when it turned out that the Commission was given money to climate activists to convince the MEPs to pass the Commission's legislation. I mean, it's a big scandal. There are now sort of investigations coming from the right wing in Brussels to try and figure out about this weird cycle, and hopefully there'll be a spotlight put on it soon. But it's a very unhealthy and undemocratic way, but it seems to be working out really well for the activists.
So we're going to talk about this conference that's just been held at the end of June in Barcelona, where I am, and it was run by a group called IGLEO, which is how would you describe IGLEO? What are they exactly? Are they kind of an NGO?
Yeah, so after I booked my ticket to IGLEO, I was asking some friends, and Faika El Nagashi, who you might know, she's this Austrian former Green MP. She said, I thought IGLEO was just any other NGO that just got a grant from the EU years ago and has just been building up its advocacy capacity ever since. But in fact, it started as a Council of Europe project. So there was a time, and I think it harks back to that time, there was a time that the Council of Europe obviously didn't do any LGBTQ stuff, but they did do anti-bullying and they did do anti-hate. And those projects were they were common in the early 2000s. And those projects, those anti-hate, anti-bullying, seem to have morphed into LGBTIQ stuff. So I think IGLIO began as maybe an internal Council of Europe thing. And when we went to the conference, we saw that it's co-organized between IGLIO and the Council of Europe. So it's people within the Council of Europe who are sort of the real force behind that. However, IGLIO has been getting millions from the European Commission in the last few years. And IGLIO so it is an NGO now. Like, it's established as I think I looked up their statutes. I think they're established under Belgian law as a non-profit, as an association. They are getting millions, as I said, from the Commission, and they are the ones who commissioned the Dentons document. So the Dentons document will be known to lots of people in gender world. There was a project a few years ago, whereby legal companies like lawyers networks decided they were going to help the LGBTIQ cause by offering to do some pro bono work on their behalf. So one of those, associated with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, I think, said they were commissioned by IGLIO to do a sort of a lay of the land of self-ID laws in Europe. And that became known as the Dentons document, because sort of described how self-ID was progressing in various EU countries, and in which countries had done well and which hadn't done so well, and what were the strategies, best practice, all that stuff. And why the Dentons document is really famous is because it said Ireland did a really great job because they were able to hide gender identity law inside the more popular reforms such as gay marriage. So this was like a smoking gun for a lot of people, because they were like, oh my God, look, this is the strategy. And I mean, again, it's just standards. It was horrible to see it written like that, like literally trick people. But it kind of is, it was just somebody admitting in black and white how this sort of stuff works, like it's just politics as well, isn't it? It's like they know that self-ID is not a popular issue, it's not a popular topic. So this document was essentially laying out how you can pass your unpopular policies. The rights of others be damned, So that's what IGLIO is kind of famous for, is that Dentons document, because they're the ones who put it out. Why would the Council of Europe care about queer young people, as they call themselves? Why would the EU care about queer young people? Why would the UN care about queer young people? You have to sort of look at the policy or legal objectives that those bodies have, and then try to figure out why is it in the interest of the EU to give so much money to these young people. I mean, we were there, we saw they don't look well, it doesn't look like a good project to support. And the policies that line up with the objectives of IGLIO for the Commission are comprehensive sexuality education is one thing, especially for the UN. That's been a huge thing, comprehensive sexuality education. And also like health. So health, and I mean specifically health of young gay guys who need to please get on PrEP. So those are two things. Like anti-bullying, yeah, we all care that young people aren't getting bullied, but like why? So I think IGLIO have got like 5 million from the European Commission in the last 5 years. Like, why would they have so much money? Last 3 years even. We can check it out on the transparency portal, but they've gotten so many millions in the last few years. Like, why? And it's probably because there's people inside the Commission who care a lot about this cause or whatever, or the Commission has this sort of priority to fulfill, and IGLIO is there so that money gets channeled to them because they do the best grant proposal, whatever, I don't know, but they're giving them operating grant money. And I think it's a lot to do with these two things, health and comprehensive sexuality education. So IGLIO basically gets an operating grant from the Commission of millions, and it goes up each year, it seems, and it went up this year, despite the fact that it's becoming less and less popular what they're doing. More and more people are becoming aware of this Queer Kids project. IGLIO got even more money this year, and the reason they got more money is because USAID, Donald Trump stopped USAID from funding all of these global entities. So you won't hear it said out loud, and they don't publicize it on their websites, but all these organizations were getting money from USAID. And then when USAID stopped, all these lobbyists were showing up to the commissioners in the European Union and saying, you need to fill the gap where USAID has dropped the ball. And we've recently seen the figures have come out. And so indeed, the Commission has stepped in and has increased the funding to these organisations. So that's despite the fact that this is increasingly unpopular in Europe. But just to note that at that conference that we went to, there was representatives of another EU-funded project that's separate to the operating grant that IGLIO gets, and it was an EU-funded project on health, and it's basically HIV/AIDS. So young queer people, this is the key population for HIV/AIDS funding targeting, and so that's also part of where the money is coming from. So it's not all just peace and love. We want gay kids to be happy. It's actually none of that. The Commission and the Council of Europe and the UN, they all have their own goals. They're not doing this to do these kids favors and keep them in jobs. They're doing it because they have their own policy goals that line up more or less neatly. That's my analysis.
It's incredible, really, that so much funding goes into this as opposed to other things that you might think would
racism, for example.
Deserve, yeah, exactly, like race, like disability, all of that other poverty, kids that are socially disadvantaged. You can think of lots of ways that kids could be at a disadvantage in school.
Yeah.
And a lot of those things don't seem to get any attention, and yet this is everything.
Huge.
I find it hard to explain. So this specific conference, the way that it was framed was there was the assertion that LGBTQI plus pupils face very, very high levels of violence and bullying, and therefore the IGLIO members are going to develop policies to combat this problem. And this conference was all about bringing people together to talk about how to do that. One of the things that it's important to understand when you go to a conference like this is there's these key terms that people might not understand if they haven't been to something like this before. Inclusion, for a start, which sounds like such a benign word, because who wouldn't want everyone to be included in education? But inclusion doesn't quite mean exactly that. When they're talking about inclusive policies, it's gender identity ideology ideas into education. So that means accepting that boys who say they're girls are girls, and that everybody has to go along with that, and anything that isn't on message and completely in line with this ideological approach is exclusion.
Yeah. I mean, it's really Orwellian. But yeah, talking about inclusion and equity and diversity, all those words hide what you're really doing is normalizing this extremely weird, bizarre, pseudoscientific concept. You just don't want to call it what it is. So we're just going to mask it with this lovely sounding word. And the bizarro world concept is the idea, that sex isn't real, or sex isn't as important as gender identity, and every young kid has one, and they may end up being a different one. But there's important to know on the word queer as well, is that queer is also about it's not just sexuality, it's also queer lifestyles and also fat positivity. I don't know if you noticed a lot of obese people, neurodivergent, people with walking sticks, so disabilities. So queer is supposed to encompass all sorts of alternative ways of being, which is a real upper middle class sort of way of sort of seeing the world. It's well, that's not really what education is about. Education is sort of being about let's try and find a common way to deal with all these different types of people in the world and give them the best opportunity for the best outcomes. But here we're talking about these extreme ideas, that being morbidly obese is cool and acceptable and normal, and that drag queens, there was a drag queen MC, drag queens, this is cool and normal, and using a walking stick at 21 because you've got osteoporosis because you take testosterone, that's cool and normal. It's no, it's queer pupils is almost an oxymoron. What kind of society do you want to create by saying to everyone, okay, big up the things that make it difficult to live in society? Queer just means not normal, the opposite of normal, boundaryless. And I mean, education for me as a mother, I'm just education is sort of about boundaries. It's sort of about teaching people to live within the boundaries of societies. But yeah, all this flattening language all the time, never getting to the point of what they're actually saying. It's really difficult in those conferences because I've gone to a lot of them and you're waiting for someone to say something real and they rarely do. But if you learn to read between the lines and you understand the kind of language, sometimes they come out with some absolute whoppers, which you got to hear, but I didn't because I got kicked out.
That's what we're going to get onto. I just want to quickly mention SOGIESC, which is this acronym that stands for sexual orientation, okay, cool, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. So why do they say sex characteristics, not just sex?
Well, you can imagine there were two terms. One is SOGIESC and the other one is LGBTIQ. And it was decided that at a UN level and at the Council of Europe level, they decided to stop saying LGBTIQ. I mean, not stop, but they sort of instituted this new idea of SOGIESC because LGBTIQ, if you think about those individual words, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, they describe identities that are quite Western. Whereas if you want to universalize it, you want to talk about sexual orientation, because that could be anything. If you want to talk about, rather than saying this person is trans, you can talk about gender identity. And so the sex characteristics, if we're going by the same sort of schema and we're saying, well, LGBTIQ, those are identities, whereas SOGIESC describes the category sexual orientation instead of saying lesbian, gay, bi, gender identity instead of saying trans, sex characteristics instead of saying intersex. So because you might not be called intersex in Indonesia, you might be called something else. So what we're doing when we're advocating at an international level, they said the way to universalize it is to try and put it into these more broader.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of understood it as almost as a way of erasing the concept of sex itself, like male and female. So if you can talk about people have sex characteristics, it's not like two distinct categories, then they can sort of just blur that a little bit. So it's sort of about taking away the concept of sex.
I think that, yes, but if we think of the people who came up with this idea, how I see it is they were thinking in terms of advocacy. So we're like, we want to prevent discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, whatever that may be, not going into specifics. We want to take away discrimination on the basis of gender identity, whatever you may choose to identify as, regardless in your culture what it is. And we want to take away discrimination on the basis of sex characteristics, because intersex isn't one thing. And like intersex is a little bit too specific. So I think they wanted sex characteristics makes it wider.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wanted to define those terms, because when you go in there, it is like going into another world, especially in this environment where everybody is assumed to be on board, But anyway, so we went to the opening plenary of the conference.
That wasn't the plenary.
I think it was the opening ceremony or something we managed to go to.
Exactly.
And then we had a little drink on the terrace. And then the next morning, when you came in, ready for an action-packed day of SOGIESC principles, what happened?
Well, so going back to the night before when I went in to pick up my badge, I walked up to the desk and I looked straight into the eyes of the executive director, who's an Irish woman. And she seemed something flickered in her eyes. And I was like, oh, shit, she knows who I am. But she didn't say anything. She just gave me the thing to sign in. And then she was watching as I wrote. And there was a bit that came to pronouns. And I was just like, do it, do it, do it. And then I couldn't do it. So just put a line through it. I was like, I can't fucking do this. So obviously that piqued her interest also. And then she gave me my stuff and I walked away. And then I thought it was fine. And we went to the opening ceremony. There was like a drag queen. It was extremely try hard. It wasn't funny. It wasn't really entertaining. Everyone looked sort of nervous. They had to like close off half the theater because there weren't enough people to fill the seats and they didn't want it to look like, that nobody showed up and whatever. And so, yeah, there was this extremely unfunny, fat Spanish drag queen who introduced all these, like, it was such a weird atmosphere. He introduced all these like honchos from the regional, for provincial government and from the Council of Europe. And then we had an MEP, the usual MEP, the same one who always shows up to all these things, Kim van Spaardentak, who's like an absolute gender nutter. So it was just really awkward and weird. And everyone in the audience was on a grift. As far as I could tell, they were all either UNESCO or UNHCR. It's like, oh, are you still at Amnesty? Yeah, I'm still at Amnesty. Oh, but I've moved on now. Now I'm going to do this, and this other organization. So everyone around you was like a young person in zany clothes. They all look exactly the same. Like it's just a blur of fluorescent and piercings. And they're all posh. They're all got cushy jobs in these like humanitarian do-gooder organizations. And then you've got this drag queen. And like a lot of it is sort of about sex, but it's so sexless. You know, because you get a drag queen, which is a thing that originated in like, you know, it's sexualized sort of gay performance or whatever. And then everyone there has got like a funky, cool gender or sexuality, or has like, you know, they call themselves polyamorous. So they're all in like these relationships with like a whole bunch of people, and they're all queer, and they're all like, you know, talking about like get on PrEP and all. I have never seen a more sexless bunch in my whole life. And sometimes I think like, you'll never meet someone more afraid of actual sex than these people. Like, I almost feel like they hit adulthood and they go, oh God, I don't want to, like, you know, put my thing in that thing. And they're like, oh, maybe what I'll do is I'll just adopt a non-binary identity and I'll pretend I'm like, I don't fucking know. Like,
I mean, it's so sad. It's like this is the generation that's been completely brought up on internet porn and, you know, and all of this stuff. A lot of the young people have been, the ones who are in their early 20s now, have been completely immersed in this since they were tweens, you know.
Do you think that's what it is? Because I wonder, like, is it exposure to porn before they're ready, or I don't know what it is. I can't imagine.
Well, I think if you've seen hardcore porn before you've even held someone's hand or like, you know, had a snog behind the bike sheds, then, I mean, that's got to mess you up. It shouldn't go that way around. I don't know. And I found that such an irony, is they're saying young people's mental health now is appalling compared to how it was a while ago. Well, for the last decade and a bit, they've been pushing these policies. So how is it working out? You know, like,
I don't think it's working, whatever you're doing. And also, like, they all look unhealthy and they all look so determined to uglify themselves. You know, it's not the same is not necessarily the case with the boys. Like, the gay boys, they have some funky, weird mullets and stuff. But like, the girls are doing their utmost to uglify themselves. And it's almost like, please don't touch me, sort of. And also so much obesity, and they just look terrible. They seem like in terrible mental health, you know, despite all the bright colors and stuff. It's one of the most dystopian things you'll ever see. And especially because they were all young. Like, I've been to a lot of those things, but though this one was pretty bad. So yeah, we managed to get through to that. We went up on a terrace. We had some free warm beers, just observing people. We were two oldest people there, I guess. Among the two oldest people there, two old biddies sitting in the corner eating free food. And even the executive director, Bella Fitzpatrick, she walked out and saw us a couple of times, and I was like, I knew she knew there was something up with me or us or whatever, but I never expected to happen what happened next. So I went home, and up bright and early the next morning, headed over. I went in and I was just waiting. I was just sort of hanging around outside the plenary hall to go in, and she came up to me, Bella Fitzpatrick, and I had already pressed record on my dictaphone because I was going to record the plenary just for memory. She said, so I had used a different name to get in. She addressed me by Roisin, so I knew the gig was up, but I was like, she's never going to kick me out. Like, what have I done? She can't kick me out. I think that's against the law anyway. And she started talking to me, and she seemed to think that I was going to, or she seemed to pretend to think that I was going to start abusing the participants in some way, or calling them mean names, or being aggressive with them or something. And I tried to reassure her, and I said, oh, no, I come to these things all the time. I don't ever even really talk to anyone. I just observe and I record sometimes, and I see what's going on, and, you know. And she said, well, we know about you. We know about your journalism. I was like, yeah. And she said, when I listened back to the recording, she said something that I'd forgotten, which was, do you not care about our humanity? Which is such a, Jesus, victim-y. My God. Like, so I said, do you not care about our humanity? I was like, I'm a woman, and like, you know, you're a woman. Why are you being a doormat for everyone to walk all over women? Like, you know what I mean? What about our, like, have you considered the other side. And I said, it's really nice to actually see you and to talk to you. And I would love if we could go and have a chat and talk about this properly, whether today or another time when the concert's over. Like, all I want to do is to talk to people like you, but people like you never answer me or answer my emails or, but this would be really, really good. You can explain to me why I'm failing to see something about your humanity, and I can explain to you why it's so insulting what you're doing here and why I find it so damaging and harmful to young people, etc., etc. And she was like, absolutely no way. And then to reassure her, I said, I was like, don't worry, I'm not going to upset anyone. I talk to people all the time in and out of the cult. I said something like that. And then the word cult, her ears wiggled. And then I said, also, I speak to boys all the time who are sort of caught up in this, whether they're, an autogynephilic men, cross-dressers, transvestite. And these are men who call themselves autogynephilic and people who call themselves cross-dressers, people who call themselves transvestites. And she was like, okay, that's it. You've broken our code of conduct, of hateful conduct. You're out. You're getting out. And I was just like, what? And I said, but you said hateful things as well. And she was like, what did I say that was hateful? And there was no words. She hadn't called me a TERF at that point to my face. But I was like, well, you hate what I do. I hate what you do. So what? Like, you know what I mean? We're at a conference. She was like, you're out, get out. So I was like, shit, I'm getting kicked out. I had lost 2 days of work for this because I had to take 2 days off. I'm an independent contractor. I spent all this money on flights and now I have to get out. And she was like, would you like to leave on your own or shall I get security? And I was like, okay, get security because that might be like, it's good for content. I'll hit record on my thing and I'll be like dragged out by 2 big burly Spanish bouncers. And she comes back with this cute little gay guy, like a beautiful, like, I feel very motherly to them all. It's just, look at these little, just so beautiful. Like, what are you doing with your life, So I was like, okay, like, we'll walk out together. So he was like, we're not going to go round and round in circles. I'm just going to kick you out. And I was like, yeah, whatever. So I walked to the door and I tried to get a few last words in. Everything is recorded. So if anyone wants to see it, but she was like, I said to her, this is the last time. And her gay bodyguard said, oh, yeah, sure, this is the last time. You're never getting into our conferences again. I was like, no, I think this is the last time for you that you're going to get away with this. Like, no, it's deeply unpopular. You're spending millions in public money on something that, like, you said it yourself, Annette. The atmosphere was extremely downbeat. Like, this doesn't look like a healthy movement that's going places, despite all the bright colors and the free booze and all this stuff. Like, it's on it. I feel like it's on its last legs. And then she sort of said something quite. She was getting braver as we got closer to the door, and she said, you can go get your own conference. Oh, you don't have one or something, look at me and my big €1 million conference. And I was like, yeah, I can't get the institutions to give me any money. Like, you're taking all the money, but you shouldn't be. Like, this is bullshit what you're doing. Anyway, they kicked me out. And then she said, in Irish, she said goodbye, which is just like, there's this huge thing in Ireland at the moment where, like, very, very posh people are sort of gentrifying the Irish language, which is really weird. And she's just a perfect example of that. She's an extremely posh, extreme body positivity girl, just so you can picture what I'm talking about, which I think you know what I mean. Very bright colors, and also just like insufferable victim mentality, these people have all they are building a castle out of sand, and it's just collapsing. Like, the whole thing is bullshit. They are telling young people, you are demonized by society. Everyone hates you. Your mental health is suffering. We need more money. We need more rainbow crossings. We need more laws. We need more hate speech, And this was her little fiefdom where she introduced a hate speech law. So when I said the word cult and I said the words autogynephile and transvestite, she was like, oh, you've broken the hate speech law. You're out now. And I was like, that's the kind of world that they're trying to construct, that, and it feels to me like the walls are closing in around them, like they're in this, it's like Jonestown or something, that's really like the feeling that I get from them. So she kicked me out in the street and I was like, I wonder if Annette is there yet. And then we bumped into each other on the street, obviously. So I contacted the feminist. I contacted Amparo from WDI, as any TERFs will know who she is. Amparo Domingo.
Friend of the show. I did an episode with her on Gender Looper.
She's great. And she said, contact Sylvia Carrasco, or was that you maybe? Both of you said
Sylvia Carrasco, another friend of the pod.
And she's a feminist supreme. And so she said to me, go to the police. So I found myself walking through the streets. Went to the police. They were like, no, you're in the wrong police station. You need to go to the one up at the Ramblas, which is like the Vegas strip of Barcelona. And it's like crazy up there. And so I went to they wouldn't even let me into the station because there was like a screening barrier outside the station. And this tough policewoman said to me, what do you want? And I said, I've just been kicked out of a conference for my beliefs. She's there with her gun or whatever. And I was like, and Sylvia had said to me, like, they're going to say no, go away, but this is just more receipts that no, our women's rights aren't protected. So I was like, okay, so you're telling me that I said, it's an international conference. It's taking place in Barcelona. I bought a ticket. I went in there and now they've turfed me out in the street because they don't like my political views. And she was like, that's for a different, that's not a criminal matter. So I was like, okay, but that's all recorded anyway as well. And then just at that moment, I got a phone call from my hotel saying, hey, checkout time is like past. You're supposed to be out by now. And I was like, what are you talking about? I've booked 3 nights in this place. And they were like, no, you didn't. You only booked 2. So I was like, shit. So he was like, and we've no rooms left for tonight. So I was like, oh no, I've been kicked out of the conference. I'm getting kicked out of my hotel. It's roasting hot. I'm at this police station in the Ramblas. And then I was like, oh, fuck it, I'm just going to get a really fancy hotel with a swimming pool. And then so I basically spent the next couple of days eating with you and lying by the pool. So it didn't turn out that badly in the end, but it's the first time I've been kicked out. And I think it's probably the last time I'm going to get away with booking a ticket like that under a fake name, because maybe my face is too recognizable now. I don't know. But I do wonder what I should do about it. Considering that it's taxpayer money, you know.
When the first session after you were asked to leave, they did say something about the code of conduct from the stage and that anybody not
no wrong speak.
Yeah, so I think they were a bit rattled because when I came in, which was, you know, shortly after you left, nobody gave me a second glance, but they were all huddled at the front, obviously having a bit of a debrief after what had happened with you.
And I heard she told you certain porky pies, actually.
She did. I mean, that was interesting because once you'd been thrown out, I thought, oh my God, I better be on my best behavior. I just wandered in. I went to the first session and then I went to the coffee break. And as I was standing there with a cup of coffee in one hand and some empanada thing in the other, she came up to me and said, oh, can I talk to you for a minute? And she just said, I just wanted to let you know that the woman that you were talking to yesterday on the terrace, she might have recorded you. I thought you should know because she's a massive TERF, I think is what you were described as. And you're a right-wing activist, apparently. And you're funded, I believe, by, she said, Hungary.
Did she say MCC or did she just say Hungary or Orban?
It's hard to remember, but I think she said something like a right-wing a group from Hungary or something like that. Maybe she said MCC. So I just said, oh, really? Oh, well, we didn't really talk about anything interesting. I said, we talked about the menopause. And she said that it was a very aggressive confrontation with you, that you were using TERF terms, that you said trans-identified male. So that was a crime. Autogynephilia, that was definitely off limits, and that you were extremely aggressive and that it was terrible. So I just said thanks for letting me know, and that was it.
Well, I went to my fancy new hotel and I wrote her an email, so I'm just going to read out what I wrote to her. So, invitation to talk. Hi Bella, it was unfortunate to meet today under such bad and weird circumstances. My invitation to have a real conversation together is sincere. I find your ideological perspective as hateful as you find mine. The only real difference between us is that you have the weight of millions of euros and all the elite institutions behind you, which makes your claims about the nature of reality seem more legitimate. But if it weren't for all that, we would just be 2 women with a difference of opinion about how we should approach gender stereotypes and gender nonconformity, which is funny because she probably doesn't identify as a woman, but who knows. And no, because I attended some MCC events doesn't mean that they fund me. I didn't tell you this, did I? But I sort of said to her, I know what you've been saying about me behind my back, like schoolgirl stuff. I attended some MCC events. It doesn't mean that they fund me. They wish, and believe me, they have tried. Orban is a corrupt authoritarian. He would like both of us chained up in the kitchen. I'll go to his Brussels events when they're interested and they concern women, but I would never take anything from him except a glass of Prosecco. So I went to the police station to file a complaint after you had me removed upon the advice of Catalonia feminists who would like to make a big deal of it because of the participation of local government reps and the lack of protection for women, obviously. I told the women to go ahead and tweet about it if they want, but I won't make a social media drama about it if you would agree to talk to me off the record over a coffee or a beer, womano a womano, in which case I will be happy to drop everything. I'm here to understand what happened to make so many women put men's needs over ours. I suspect it has something to do with class, but I'm not sure. I would love to talk about it. I don't bite. Let me know. Peace. And so she didn't respond to that. And then I heard that she was saying other things about me being aggressive. So I hope you don't mind. But I also said that to her. I didn't say who told me because I wanted.
Well, man, I don't care.
Good. Hi again. I heard you've told some people that I was aggressive during our interaction. You should know that I had my dictaphone recording in my handbag the whole time in preparation for the plenary event. We both know that I was extremely cordial and polite, so you risk making yourself sound like a liar to your funders and your supporters if you continue to spread that falsehood along with the MCC accusation. It's better to be truthful about all of this because the truth always comes out in the end. My invitation to talk still stands. Let me know by close of business, because at that point the feminists had prepared a press release about this Irish TERF being kicked out of an event. So she never answered any of my emails, but I think that was a pretty sincere and nice thing to do. But as you said, it's like they can't actually address any of the issues. It's very, very difficult for them to, because it's all blah and it's all a castle made of sand and it's all fake and pure fantasy, isn't it? Like, what did you hear in the sessions?
I thought of all the sessions I went to, I thought there were two that were really interesting and kind of illustrate what's happening there. So maybe for listeners that will be useful. There was one that was a panel of kind of high-level people. And so it was all about how their objectives of getting these ideas into policy are pushed through at the level of the Council of Europe, the ministers, all of that, and actually how they do that. And then the other session, which I'll talk about in a minute, is much more of they're building a tool, and it's much more about how to do it on the ground. So the first session was called Addressing Bullying, Tackling Violence and Ensuring Safer Education Systems for All Through Inclusive Curricula. And that was moderated by someone called Gabriela Kaleja. She's a senior policy advisor at the SOGIESC unit of the Council of Europe. And there were quite a few people on the panel. They were all sort of high level, and they were all quite interesting. But I'm just going to focus on Catherine O'Sullivan because she's an independent expert on a committee within the Council of Europe. So basically the Council of Europe, she explained all this. The Council of Europe has a strategy for the rights of the child, which is running from 2022 to 2027. And so within that, one of the threads or priorities is the freedom from violence for all children. And so she is this independent member of a committee of experts. And what they've been doing is producing, amongst other things, a feasibility study on comprehensive sexuality education, CSE, as a way of preventing violence against children. So they've tied these two things together. The idea is that what will happen is they've done this feasibility study, and this then goes through several steps, and then will become a draft recommendation that is presented to the ministers who hopefully, according to Catherine O'Sullivan, will adopt it. So if they did adopt it, it's still a non-binding recommendation, but she explained that it can be very influential because it kind of gives a framework that countries can use to implement these kind of ideas into their own national context. So what I thought was interesting is that she explained very clearly how they do this. So they start from the position that comprehensive sexuality education, and again, you kind of have to read between the lines there, because I'm a parent. I'm in favor of my kid getting comprehensive sexuality education, assuming that that is good quality information that's relevant to her in her age, and that it's factually accurate and scientific. But what they mean by comprehensive sexuality education goes much further than that. The guy from UNESCO, Sylvian, talked about how it has to be not only a mirror, but also a window. So it takes children, it reflects back their realities, but it also opens up new possibilities. Very much sexualizing children, talking about children's romantic partners as well, without sort of, it gets a bit vague, like children, young people. Who has romantic partners? Like, at which age are we talking about here? Anyway, so they start from the position that comprehensive sexuality education is what must happen. And then Kathryn O'Sullivan explained that what they do is they tie it to the concept of human rights very explicitly, so that it's the right of the child to have what they already want, what these guys want, which is this particular comprehensive sexuality education. And so if you are sort of opposing this, then that means you are violating the rights of the child. So it was really like, oh, this is how the sausages are made moment. Maybe it's more obvious to you. And I suppose that in this sort of advocacy world, that tying things to human rights is kind of pretty standard. But she really was so open about it, that once it's tied to human rights, then it's not optional. Countries have to do it because countries are signed up to human rights. And also they must really do it comprehensively. So they must make sure that everyone gets it. They have to fund teacher training. They must provide it to all groups. And there must be enforcement. And she also said that it helps counter opposition from families or others, because then you've got it as, again, a kind of clash of rights, a clash between families' rights or parents' rights over the children and the child's right to have this. So she talked specifically about parental opt-outs, and that this framing gave countries the kind of way of implementing this in a way that they don't have to be bothered by parents or others, being concerned about the actual content. And it was really clear that they expect opposition. They completely understand that people don't want this, that families don't want this, that people don't like it, that they are anticipating that when they try to implement this, that there will be opposition. And so they're kind of preempting that by making sure they know how they're going to resist that opposition. And I really think that's curious, because this is Europe. It's 2025. Most people are very socially liberal. Most families are not concerned if their kids are going to grow up to be gay, or you have, religious groups and you have more conservative areas. But if we're talking about certainly in Western Europe and here in Spain, most people are very liberal. And so the idea that even in that context, they know that they're going to get opposition if people know about it, I think that's very, very telling.
Yeah, there's the story of comprehensive sexuality education. It's such an ongoing, long drawn out saga. It was first discussed in Cairo ICPD in 1994, where they said everyone has the right to comprehensive sexuality education. And at its very basis, it was about, young women were getting pregnant without even knowing anything about contraception, and they were being bullied into marrying older men, and they were, women marry young to men who are much older, who've had loads of sexual partners. The girls can't say no. There was all this very valid reasons why young girls should be sat down in a place that's probably free from church influence and free from parental influence and told, look, there are ways ways that you can prevent yourself becoming a mother at 13. This is the base of comprehensive. It was kind of like a rights-based proposal, and it makes a lot of sense, but it just morphed in the mid-2010s into something just unrecognizable. So it's been really difficult to get conservative countries to adopt comprehensive sexuality education. And UNESCO produced a version of what it should look like in 2009, and it was fairly tame, and I think it mentioned gender identity once. But then for some reason in 2017, 2018, they hired American consultants to revamp the UNESCO Comprehensive Sexuality Education Guidelines, and it's just gender all the way down. It's much more about children's sexuality. And so in the mid-2010s, comprehensive sexuality education got totally queered. The difference in it is huge. So this Council of Europe project is obviously where they're trying to say, so I just have it open here, a feasibility study to see if they can use it from a child's rights perspective. Isn't that it?
Yeah. Because one of the streams is to eliminate violence against children. And so what they're saying is that this kind of CSE helps to eliminate violence against children, because the SOGIESC bullying, as they describe it, is violence against children.
Right. So they're saying as a way to get comprehensive sexuality education established in these places, we're going to say it's actually tied to violence against children. And if you're against violence against children, you're going to implement comprehensive sexuality education that's inclusive of SOGIESC.
Yes, that's how they do it.
It's interesting that you felt that feeling of resistance is also a given, because, this has proven so unpopular. I think, wasn't it eventually, due to pressure from activists and TERFs and stuff, that in the UK, their PSHE or SPHE or whatever, they changed how they presented gender identity in there as a result of pressure. But in Belgium has the absolute worst. I haven't seen all of them, but I've seen a few of them. But Belgium talks about transactional sex, commercial sex, having sex for money, starting from 14 years old. This is in the comprehensive sexuality education, and it's the harm reduction philosophy. So let me just, for people who don't know this, because this is really clever strategy, actually, they decided that the best way to conduct this CSE sex education, and the way to get around parental objections, is to basically present it as if they are not coming in as giving kids this information. They go into the classroom and they say, has anybody got any questions? I don't know if they're doing this in Spain as well. So they say to the kids, have you, anybody got any questions about any of the topics? And so what's supposed to happen is that the kid is supposed to bring the controversial question, and then the teacher or the facilitator, and they're not supposed to be teachers, they're supposed to be outside third-party facilitators who we know in lots of countries are dodgy as fuck. I'm sorry, but we've looked into them in Belgium, and I've seen two men who are going to be in headlines in the future, who are unqualified, who have no background in anything relevant, who are sexologists who talk about erectile dysfunction in couples, and who are now going into little kids' school to talk to them about transactional sex and gender identity and being born in the wrong body and getting on PrEP and all this stuff. But anyway, the way it's supposed to happen is you're supposed to you invite the kids to ask the questions. So the kids bring up the things, so then you can't be accused of bringing up the inappropriate topic. And I heard a story in Ireland, where somewhere in the west of Ireland, and maybe I've talked about this in my podcast before, where when the kids were invited to ask a question, one kid said, how much does a prostitute get paid per hour? So what happens there is everyone gets brought down to the level of the person with the trashiest home situation. The person who's been exposed to the worst of the worst, everyone else gets to hear about it. And then that gives the organizers, the pushers of this, a get out of jail free card, because they can say, well, it was the kid who brought it up, it wasn't us. So when my son went in for his first session, and he knew that everyone was watching out for it, because my kid's school's full of Muslims and they really don't want any of this. They were never even allowed into the very factual biology sort of sex education. They were kept out of school for that. So for this, they were really keeping an eye out. So obviously it had to be all secretive. So my kid comes home one day and said, oh, we finally had our first EVERAST course, our comprehensive sexuality education. And indeed, as predicted, the teacher said, has anybody got any questions? I'm sure you've heard people talking about this and that, have you can write down your questions and ask us afterwards. But because there'd been such a media storm about the sexuality education, that's all anyone wanted to ask about. So they weren't asking the right questions about puberty and sex and prostitution. They were asking about, like, why is ever so controversial, and are we going to have to do this class again? And, you know, so it was all very meta. And then at the end, the facilitator said to them, does nobody have any questions about puberty? Which shows that it was like they were expected to come with the questions, and then the teachers have a big book, and the book, in all countries you'll find it's the same thing, has these grids saying this is what you might be expected to be asked at this age, this age, this age, this age. So when I say in Belgium they've got this bit about transactional sex or commercial sex, it's not that the facilitator has to go in and bring up that subject. It's like, you're going to be maybe asked about this question at this age, and here's the answer to it. And it's just sort of like, I don't think that's appropriate.
That was actually something that was brought up in that session in a slightly different way, and also a bit of a theme throughout the conference, this idea of things being child-led. And that's a real fashion throughout all of education and, you know, frankly, parenting philosophies as well. It's like, it's all very good to be child-led, and superficially it sounds fine, but it ends up being a really good excuse to be able to blamelessly introduce things like, why would you want to be talking to 14-year-olds about prostitution, for example? And so it's almost like it's used as a justification. Oh, well, the kids want this, and so therefore we're providing it. And Catherine O'Sullivan said that as well. It's like, the children can advocate for themselves. You know, we need to empower them with the knowledge that they have the right to this information, and so then they can advocate for themselves. And it really feels like that's a way for them to wriggle out of responsibility for planting this stuff. There needs to be scrutiny of what the kids are being taught, because it's not just religious conservatives who don't, you know, I'm not a parent who would take my kid out of sex education class because I'm like conservative or something. I'm not at all. I want her to have very good quality sex education that's accurate, that's detailed, that's relevant to her. And I think all kids should get that, like what you were talking about before, about how their own bodies work, about, you know, having the right to say no to people and control who touches them, and how relationships should work and stuff like that. But that is not what is being introduced here. And I think all it takes is scrutiny. If you really get to look at what they're actually teaching, then people don't want it. The more they know about it, the less they want it. And it's not because they're conservatives. And that's something else that's kind of just assumed, that anybody who has any objections is a conservative or religious, or they've been yeah, or they've been influenced by anti-gender and anti-rights narratives in the hostile media, or, you know, that's the way that it's conceptualized. There's no thing of like, well, maybe they've got a point, maybe we should consider that, maybe we should try and provide what people actually want, like a kind of, you know, where is the baseline consensus that everybody can agree, like,
I think it's definitely this harm reduction idea. Like, there are huge problems in Africa with girls getting married too young. They don't have any choice in space in their pregnancies. They have older partners, so they get diseases. They're not allowed to go to a contraception clinic. They don't even know what it is. The men beat the shit out of them. You know, in Africa, there's also in some places like a huge culture of like transactional sex, and you also have like, you can't be gay in a lot of countries, so you have to be a fake woman. You have to be a man who pretends to be a woman. So this is where it's very important to talk about, like, you know, gender identity and trans and stuff. That doesn't apply to our countries. And it's sort of like, this is sort of the internationalization of everything. We're trying to fix problems that are happening elsewhere. It's like we're applying the solutions to problems in Zimbabwe, in Brussels, you know. My big problem with comprehensive sexuality education here is that in the Belgian one, gender identity is mentioned like 40 or 50 times, and it's mentioned more often than sexual orientation. And I just think like there's even a part in it where it's like, you know, you can change some people when they feel really uncomfortable, they change their body, and this can be done by surgery, and like, it's mental. You shouldn't be telling kids that. Like, and in my kids' school, there are little kids who are very confused about their identity and stuff. So I'm not in principle against comprehensive sexuality education at all, but the pressure to adopt it is absolutely absolutely huge. And so as we were talking about earlier, activists look around to see what treaties and conventions and agreements and memoranda of understanding exist already in the world, and they say, how can I wedge my issue into that? And when a couple of years ago, I started to get really worried that they were going to use the Convention on the Rights of the Child to start making this argument. And I did see that it was used actually in a court case in Argentina. I think there's some parent who wanted to get their kid transed. And one of the arguments that was made was that in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, kids have a right to XYZ. And so I'm just going to read out to you here a little bit, a paper I found that was recently published. It was published last year, on how they're trying to make the claim that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child essentially grants gender affirming care to kids. So here we go. Ethical approaches on working with providing services to children have an obligation to recognize and uphold child rights. Child rights are enshrined in international human rights frameworks, including in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The convention protects the rights of children in every country in the world, apart from the USA. It's the only country that hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think it's something to do with they want to be able to marry off kids early, or something about abortion. I don't know what it is. Anyway,
We're paying for healthcare as well.
maybe, yeah. The convention rights that are particularly relevant to trans children include the right to identity, Article 8, the right to protection from violence and abuse, Article 19, the right to life, survival and development, Article 6, the right to health, Article 24, and the right not to be discriminated against in accessing all other rights, Article 2. Child rights may also be explicitly guaranteed in domestic law, as seen as to differing degrees, blah, 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 because they're talking about here Scotland, which adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child into their own domestic laws. So there you see there's 5 or 6 articles of the UNCRC that they are claiming grant you the right to transfer care. And it's because of this sort of stuff, I just put the whole thing in the bin. You can say anything is human rights. If you can claim that blocking the puberty of child comes under the right to health of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, it makes no sense. But so the conference we were at, basically you're saying that event, they were trying to say the right to the access to comprehensive sexuality education, which has been completely queered, comes under article whatever, I guess. Did they specifically say which articles?
So they're kind of selling the idea to the Council of Ministers and this proposal that they're trying to get them to take up. This is a way of guaranteeing a whole lot of rights of children. So their rights to health, their rights to all kinds of things. But the one they're really focusing on is free from violence. But somewhere in that report, I haven't got it to hand now, but it lists a whole lot of rights. It just seemed really clear to me that they start from what they already want. And this is how they get it in. So should we have a quick look at this other workshop that was later on Thursday afternoon? This one was also facilitated by somebody else from the SOGIESC unit of the Council of Europe, Giulia Bianchini, and also Ru Avila. He's from IGLEO. So what they're trying to do is create a tool that is aimed at policymakers. So this is like a work in progress. And this is one of the things that for me just made attending this conference so fascinating, because it wasn't something that was sort of public facing in a way. It was all of these guys getting together to sort of work out their policy. So it was great to be a fly on the wall. They're trying to make this tool, the SOGIESC unit in collaboration with IGLEO, and this is a tool for policymakers so that they will be able to use it to design their own systems at level of education departments, which then goes on to schools, right? And so they talked about it being sort of policy guidance. They talked about resisting anti-gender discourse and how to create an inclusive curriculum. So you can see right there that they're already anticipating that it's not wanted, because, they've got to have the anti-gender discourse. But
to let me recap, we're basically, these activists are putting together like a toolbox that they want to give to governments and say, look, if you want to have inclusive education, this is what you need to do.
Yep. Exactly. So this is much more about what they're actually trying to tell people to do this on the ground. And a lot of it made sense to me because I recently did an episode on the trans protocol that applies in schools in Catalonia. And Catalonia is very
Gender fucked.
Yes, it's like they're way out there in crazy town. And so I was like, oh, a lot of this sounds very familiar. So they're trying to kind of make this tool so that they can pass it on to places that are still not quite at the Catalonia level. And this is going to help them to get there. So the main way in is anti-bullying. So you define bullying as not being on board with the ideology, any resistance or anything is bullying. And so then it sort of gives legitimacy to punishing those who don't comply with this. And you've got to take like a whole school approach to it. Everything's inclusive, teacher training, the curriculum itself, the enforcement, the school environment. You have to manage the families. And then there's a new part that was starting to come in, and actually in the last session, the woman who was from the European Commission briefly talked about this, how they've got a new thing that's kind of hate speech that's starting to become a bit more current.
A new thing as in a new policy area, or what? Because there's a lot of funding has gone into it recently. So what did she mean, do you think?
Well, I think that they're trying to bring that concept of objections are hate speech, because that's very useful for resisting what they would call anti-gender narratives or anti-rights. They also talk about disinformation, and it's about, delegitimizing any criticism. So they're not looking for consensus. They're not interested in what people actually want. They've already got their ideas, and it's all about how to implement them. And this is really sort of like an overall sense that I got from the conference, that it really is so culty in that way. Like there's no good faith attempt to really find what works.
Or address the actual concerns of people who might be against it.
Yeah. Even just to really honestly assess what vulnerable young people need, because many of these people are indeed very vulnerable. They have poor mental health, they've got issues, they face problems. And so how do you really address it? And I think a lot of the things that they propose and that they do make things worse for those vulnerable groups. But there's just no scrutiny of that whatsoever. That's just assumed, and any opposition is just, the whole idea is how do you resist it? Just fiercely resisting opposition. You call it hate speech and disinformation. You say that it's against the rights of the child. So the practical things that they do at the school level is anti-bullying policies, training teachers so that, from the beginning, teachers are trained, they're completely indoctrinated in this stuff from their teacher training. So that feeds through to, for them to adopt those things. Inclusive curricula. And in some of the other sessions that we won't have time to go into in detail, they did talk a lot about sort of inclusive materials and especially literature. So there are these books that I actually did a thread on the Gender Looper Twitter a while ago about this, a book that they've got here. And there was a woman who is doing some PhD on this in a university in Catalonia. And it's all about normalizing these very strange concepts, like there are girls who are really boys and vice versa, and for a very young age. And in these happy little picture books for very small kids. And this woman, when she was talking about it, this wasn't in this session, this was in another one, but it was very much about influencing children's perceptions of reality. I mean, that was explicitly stated. It wasn't just about reflecting the real world as it is to children, which of course we should do, because it makes sense that children's literature includes gay people, for example, because that's what the world is really like. But when they start bringing in these really anti-scientific and just anti-reality concepts like, oh, if you're a little girl who doesn't conform to the gender stereotypes that our culture puts on little girls, then maybe you're a boy. Like introducing these ideas to young children that are actually very psychologically destabilizing and don't do anything to help a young girl in that position. I mean, if there's a young girl who's feeling a bit like she doesn't fit in because she doesn't really conform to the stereotypes or whatever, she probably does need some support, because and to be shown that it's perfectly normal to be as you are. You're acceptable just the way you are. And instead, the message that she's getting is that, like, oh, don't conform to the stereotypes. Have you ever considered that you're a boy? But anyway, so yeah, that's the inclusive curricular part. But really, I thought the clearest showing how this is the anti-bullying policies. And they say adopt clear, inclusive, anti-bullying policies. I took a photo of a slide so I can read it back to you. Laws and policies must explicitly prohibit bullying and harassment based on SOGIESC, using clear definitions. Respect and recognition of chosen name, gender identity, access to bathrooms, locker rooms, sports, uniforms, gendered activities and initiatives, diplomas. So all of this is, you must accept this, and anything else is bullying. And so that applies to all children in the school.
So that comes under the rubric of bullying.
Yes. It's like, this is what you have to create in your school environment
in order to
avoid bullying. So if you've got a boy in a class that decides he's a girl, then all the other students have to go along with that, including locker rooms, including sports, including using the gendered language accordingly to his felt identity or whatever. If they don't do that, that's bullying. So, it's done under rights, but there doesn't seem to be any consideration that, well, do other people have rights? Do girls have rights?
So let me just get this straight. So IGLIO, which is essentially a Council Europe project, they got millions off the Commission on the basis that they were going to provide certain things. And one of those things they were going to do was have events, influence stakeholders, and also create an LGBTQ inclusive education toolkit. So essentially, the Commission is going to use IGLIO to tell member states that you need to do this sort of thing in education in order to prevent bullying. So just broken it down.
This toolkit, to me, it seems like this is how you do it. So these are the things that you specifically need to put into your policies so that you can say, okay, we've done it.
Commission is essentially paying for that, though. Like, that's the EU is paying for all this with our money. Essentially, this is the thing that sort of gets me. And then there's often like a disclaimer, like whatever gets produced by these project grantees does not reflect the views of the Commission. But it's sort of like, you're not allowed to object, first of all. You get kicked out even before you even manage to object. But I mean, it's the sort of thing that could bring down the entire EU, I sort of think, because you don't fuck with people's kids. Like, you just don't. If people knew that that's how many millions were being spent on creating these kind of guidelines for countries and schools to give everything these absolute demons are asking for, I don't know how long the EU would even last, like, it's such a destructive thing. And every time I see the EU doing something like this, I just think, like, are you not aware of how unpopular this is? It's so unpopular.
It's funny because they do seem to be aware, but they seem to think that they can just impose it. And it is very, very authoritarian, even though they wouldn't think of themselves as authoritarian. But the whole way that they're like, categorizing any dissent as disinformation, hate speech, especially that at every step they take, they're anticipating that people don't want it. And I agree with you that they are underestimating what a backlash there will be. So I can't understand why they want such extreme policies.
Yeah, what's really annoying is that the EU has this plausible deniability where they say, oh, we just give them these operational grants because we want to make sure the CSOs, the civil society organizations, are represented. And then they say whatever they produce has nothing to do with us. But what they're producing now is, as we see on the website, is as a map of Europe, who's doing well and who's not doing well. And then you get like these obedient media will republish their press release every year that says, oh, Norway is top of the class for inclusive education, but the UK is really bottom of the class and they're doing terrible. And then you'll see it all over social media for a few weeks where they say, you know, the UK is the worst place in the world for trans inclusive education. And that's the influence that's directly paid for by entities like the Council of Europe and the EU. And I just think I wish more people knew about it. I mean, that's what we're trying to do here, I guess.
I think that's the key, scrutiny. Just show people what it is. And I sort of have faith in people.
But then the answer is always, oh, but it's non-binding, especially when it's Council of Europe stuff, it's non-binding. But, you know, they're getting away with absolute crazy stuff, these people, you know. I want to go in to find out what's happening and write about it, and I'm not even allowed into the plenary session. You know what I mean? It's like, where is this coming from? You know, we should be writing to all these entities and saying, you know, and when I got kicked out, I was like, well, of course I'm going to go to Council of Europe and say, you know that I was excluded from this conference. How is this still going on? I don't know. We need more journalists, better journalists who are exposing this, because that's just the tip of the iceberg.
It doesn't stand scrutiny. Like you said, it's a house of cards. So all the time they're talking about how we do this. And what they're doing is just assumed because it is a belief system. It's not based on facts and evidence. So we need people there who are asking, why is what you're doing going to achieve the outcomes that you claim? It all sounds so superficially good, but none of the actual things that they're doing are achieving those things. And in fact, they themselves say that everything is terrible and children's mental health is getting worse. So they're saying, this is not working, but we have to do more of it and we have to stop any resistance to it.
Well, I think it harks back to the original self-ID problem, which was that all of these laws were introduced without the consensus of the public. So what happened essentially was these people made an agreement with the government that some individuals, any individual who wanted, can make a contract with the government that they are no longer the sex they are in the eyes of officialdom. So a man can go into a government building and say, we agree, we signed up a contract, I'm no longer M, I'm now F, we agree, yes. The only time they'll ever interact with the government, and that matters, is going through a border control checkpoint or maybe getting, you know, some documents or whatever. That's the only time they'll interact with officialdom, and this like new contractual arrangement will have to be recognized. The rest of the time they have to deal with society, and they never asked any of us, they never spoke to any of us. And that's what's happening here with these kids as well. These people who are claiming to be acting on their behalf are going behind closed doors and getting the VIP of the top directorates and the ministries and the provincial governments to come to these air-conditioned events, and they're saying to them, right, me and you will make a deal here, okay? And we'll make a deal that you have to force your teachers to call these kids by whatever name the kids want and to call them whatever gender and pronouns they want. And we have to agree that anyone who disagrees gets detention. And, and then they come to us, it's a done deal. And they've said, we've made these contractual agreements with these kids that they are now the identity that they say they are. And it's like, well, you never asked their parents and you never asked the teachers and you never asked this. You just implemented these rules. And so if anything, it should show that this type of activism should go in the bin because it's not helping the people who they're claiming to help. But why isn't it going in the bin? Why isn't officialdom saying, oh, this isn't working, actually all the things that we wanted to. Now let's imagine if their goal is, you know, health stuff, queer health, PrEP, HIV stuff, they're gonna achieve that goal. That's fairly clear that that's easy to do. But in terms of acceptance and that we all go along with the contractual agreement that they have with the state, that we all recognize them as the sex that they're not, all that stuff, it's not working. So why aren't the governments and the ministers and everyone saying, oh, well, this isn't working, we're going to have to stop giving you money now? Because the people who are on the salaries, the people who run the organizations, they're just like digging their heels in, and they're just saying, give us more money for hate speech work and give us more money for more diversity training work. And it's like, it's not in their interest. It's not in the interest of all these NGOs to say, some people don't like our cause and we've gone the wrong way about it. I don't know how we're going to climb back down from this, because yeah, the NGOs are going to keep asking for grants every year. They're going to keep applying. They're going to keep insisting that the problem is getting worse. the governments are a little bit like newspaper editors in that sense. They're afraid of the backlash. They're afraid of these noisy parades outside their buildings.
I mean, there's a level of just kind of careerism, like, as you said, people going around from job to job. And these people absolutely just have a personal incentive to keep this stuff going, whether they believe in it or not. And the way that human psychology works is if you're in that position, you're going to convince yourself that you're doing the right thing. And you kind of are a true believer. There's a kind of progress narrative underlying all of it. Some countries are described as behind, some are very advanced. And I really think that stops people from looking at the facts. Like, is this actually good for kids? Like, when we look at these young people, like you said, with walking sticks, and these young lesbians with beards because they've been on testosterone and they just look so unhealthy, is this good for these people? Like, how is this helping? But because we've got this kind of narrative of progress that everything has to go
and any
forward.
step backwards is literally synonymous with bad, like, and I wouldn't want to go backwards in the sense of like denying people any rights that they've won or whatever, but any sort of like, hold your horses here, like, extreme body modification for young women because they like climbing trees, maybe stop doing that. And it's like, no, you can't stop or go backwards, because that's what Orban would like. That's what Vladimir Putin would like. It's just really fucked up. It's sort of dynamic.
It doesn't have to be like lesbians on testosterone or housewives back to the kitchen. Like, we can have like the important rights that people need to live flourishing lives without just completely going off the deep end in these ways that are just really unambiguously causing harm to very vulnerable
it's extremely
people.
Harmful. And wouldn't you love to get that Bella Fitzpatrick on your podcast and just talk to her and say, okay, I see your humanity and you like to be accepted as like, whatever it is, neurodivergent, body positive, queer, non-man, like whatever it is that you want to be accepted as. But, you're doing incredible amounts of harm to people. But they must, as you say, you must have to become a true believer and just sort of put all of that out of your mind. Also because you're never going to accept that you've done a lot of damage, And at the European Lesbian Conference, which I went to in Rome a couple of months ago, and I didn't really talk about it at the time because I didn't want to ruin my chances of getting into the Igloo conference, which didn't work out in the end anyways. That was a really sad one. That was a full of trans masks denying that sex is real, and it was full of men in dresses as well, and there were like sports sessions where they talked about like sport was invented by white, heterosexual, cisgender men, and it's mean to like separate people on basis of ability, that's ableist and all that fucking madness, the whole thing. And I hope there were more TERFs in that conference, and I hope people were taking notes. And I wonder what to do with this kind of information. I think my cover is blown now. I won't be able to go to any more of those kind of things. But I mean, we need to get this information out there, what the institutions are doing, and while then keeping this sort of nod and wink, sly sort of like, yeah, we're pushing millions to these crazy people to institute this crazy stuff, but we have our hands clean because we're not directly doing any of it. I think that needs to stop, honestly.
I would love to talk to any of these people, these trans activists, and that's something that people have asked me since I did the Substack. It's like, oh, so are you going to talk to any kind of like trans activists or trans people? And I absolutely would. I think it's difficult with a trans person. I mean, people can do what they want. I don't want to, question somebody's life choices, but I would be more interested in talking to activists, like people like Bella, who are really pushing these ideas. There's no way they will, because they don't want to talk about it. Sometimes you stand back and you think, but why this? Why is the funding so extreme for this? And why is the push for this just so ferocious? And I really think it's because it has to be. You have to make it absolutely overwhelming, irresistible, locked into the law, means social death if you say anything about it in certain circumstances. You can lose your job. It has to be done like that because it's so anti-science,
so unacceptable,
anti-reality, anti-human, and it goes against so much that the only way you can implement it is to be completely over the top ferocious with it.
So you're going to have to criminalize the person who says no to it, because otherwise nobody's going to accept it. Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. That's it. I wonder how things are going to go, because I know the political winds have changed, but the problem is when we're specifically talking about these institutions, the bureaucracy doesn't change when the politics change. And so in Europe now, in the EU, we have a bit more of a right-wing government than we did before. Like, they had a fucking field day for the last 5 years, the socialists and Democrats and left and Greens and all. But that's all over now. And now we've got much more sort of centrist, centre-right, if I've understood correctly, the political lay of the land. But it doesn't really matter, because it's those women from the European Commission who work in these directorates, they have not changed. They've not changed their objectives. All they see now is the same people they've been given grants for the past 5 years are now coming to them saying hate speech, hate speech, hate speech. And so the new grants have just been announced, who got what, and so much of it is concentrated on hate speech. It's terrifying. And I saw, like, when I went to the European Lesbian Conference, I was sitting behind a man from Finland who pretends to be a woman. He's a classic AGP. He was an airline pilot, autistic, older, trooned out in his 50s, destroyed his family, etc., etc. And he was there telling lesbians how they should be addressing him and how lesbians should be comporting themselves, in this lesbian conference and all this stuff. And I just found out that he's been appointed the rapporteur for, like, the Scandinavian countries for, like, hate speech against LGBTQ for the European Commission or something, some sort of special appointment. I don't know if he's paid or whatever, but this is basically the kind of people now that the Commission, because they're catching up. They're not longer doing, like, diversity charters, which is what they did for the last 5-6 years. Now they're doing countering the backlash. And because USAID has dropped out, and because there's so much, like, a lot of governments are like, oh, we're not doing that anymore. So the Commission, because it's like the most liberalizing force in the world, etc., etc., is very proud of it. And the bureaucracies are still there. They're like, okay, dumping money on this hate speech drive. It's in the SERVE program. It's called CERV, and you can see the amount of projects and the amount of NGOs that have been given money. And each one of those NGOs, the bigger ones, they'll re-grant anti-hate speech stuff to smaller NGOs all over Europe. So you can expect this is only going to get worse before it gets better. It's going to ramp up. And when I say it gets worse, we're not going to hear much about it, but our ministers are going to hear about it. All those activists are going to be printing out things from this convention, that body, this research that the Commission paid for. They're going to be putting it on their desks. They're going to be saying, look, this is how bad the situation is. And the push to get, like, hate speech laws. It was a horrible incident happened in Belgium a couple of months ago. It was on Women's Day, the 8th of March. I may have told you about it when we were in Barcelona, but Women's Day on the 8th of March, and there was a woman called Magali Cornelissen, and she showed up in a t-shirt that said, in French, it said, biological sex is real, not a misogynistic fantasy or something. Woman is real, whatever, something like that. Something very tame but turfy. She got hit in the face. She got thrown on the ground. She got attacked. Her signs were ripped up. There were stickers, Antifa stickers on her signs and stuff. She went to police. She used to be in a political party. She was affiliated with a political party, used to be a councillor. They didn't want to help her. They didn't care. And then I found out that being organised, unbeknownst to her, were a bunch of activists, LGBTQ activists, funded by the state, plus Antifa people, were organising to try and get her t-shirt used as a basis to change, as evidence, demand that they'd been making for a while, which was to add transphobia to the constitution of the country, to add transphobia and homophobia as crimes to the Belgian constitution. So they said, here we go, here's our opportunity. This woman's t-shirt is so bad, it proves detrimental to all of us. So they contacted the Belgian Institute for the Equality between Men and Women, and they said, how do we make sure this happens? We want to make sure that we can use what she did with her t-shirts to put pressure on the government to change the constitution. And the institute that was set up to protect equality between men and women helped those activists. And I know this because I was included in all the emails, because they didn't know, but I was lurking, as I do. And I saw them all coordinating, and they were getting advice from this institute. This government agency was advising them on the best way to go about bigging up their complaints. So it was like, do individual complaints, tell them I hurt you, did X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. So I went obviously to Magali and I told her that this was happening. And so she did straight away freedom of information requests. And after many, many emails, she finally got the correspondence from this government agency to the activists saying, this is how you're going to have to go after her in order to get her done for transphobia. But also, unfortunately, we concluded that she's protected under freedom of expression. So unfortunately, your case won't be able to proceed. Like, this is this is, so how is it that any man or woman in the street, if you ask them what do you think about her t-shirt, they'd be like, yeah, so what, there's two sexes, I don't care. How is it that the institute that was set up to protect the rights of women is actively helping people to criminalize a woman who said a woman is a reality, not a misogynistic fantasy? Like, that just shows you how much work went on behind the scenes. The fact that those activists knew who to contact and who to ask and how to go about it, and that they have this cozy relationship with these people in these institutional bodies, that's where it's all happening. None of it is happening in our newspaper pages. You open a newspaper, anything about trans is the same, like 12 sentences over and over again. The most vulnerable, the most marginalized. Oh, I'm just so fucking sick of these phrases. Like, you do anything to hear something real. But yeah, so you need to watch out in Spain. Everywhere you're going to see, follow it. Anyone who's in Europe right now, follow it. Look at these SERV grants. Look at where these hate speech grants are going. Keep an eye on it. Who's been elected as the rapporteur for your country? I guarantee you it's one of the worst activists has put themselves forward to be the expert, to be the rapporteur, to come to Brussels a few times a year, to have like free drinks and free lunch and tell you about how all the hateful turfs. And then the commission is going to be forced to do something about it because they paid for all the evidence that they gathered, and that's what's happening with the conversion therapy ban right now as well. They paid for all the evidence that's been gathered. They've been doing it for years, and now how can they back down now and say, well, we gave money to activists to go out and find evidence of conversion therapy and how it's ruining everyone's lives, and now what, we're just going to ignore the evidence? And it's like, well, did you ask anybody who understands psychotherapy for kids or developmental stages of children? Or no, they didn't ask any of those people.
We've actually got both of those things you just mentioned going on in Spain right now. Amparo Domingo, who you mentioned earlier, just put out there was a short video on the WDI about there's a new, the foreign ministry has appointed this kind of ambassador for LGBTQ, blah, blah, blah. And I don't know the guy. He's a career diplomat. I had a look, couldn't find anything about him really. But also we've got a proposal from the parliament to criminalise conversion practices. So that actually they've already got very harsh penalties under the ley trans, but they are now going to try and criminalise them so it actually results in jail time and a criminal conviction. And it includes everybody, including parents.
Jesus.
So basically, if you're a parent and you send your kid to a psychologist who is not completely affirmative, then, that's a risk. I mean, that's one thing is, there's talk of the backlash and the tide turning and whatever, but I don't think we should get too ahead of ourselves and not in Europe especially. I mean, one thing is the UK, but here in Spain, we have self-ID in the law. We have very, very activist education departments, and this stuff is really embedded, and it's harder to unwind it than it is to get it in there in the first place. And I mean, I really think, I don't know, I think I have faith in people that if you just show them the reality of this, people are going to be like, no. But I think also a lot of people just don't want to believe that it's that bad.
I think it's their faith in institutions, because if you realize that your government was wrong, your ministries are wrong, your bureaucracy was wrong, your activists have too much power, you just go, oh shit, my foundations are very shaky here. I thought that I was being looked after. What about what they've told me about what's in the water, or if this place is safe to swim, or I don't know, like it's
That's exactly it. I mean, going back to where we started talking about being peaked, my faith in institutions has been completely undermined. Like, oh my God, if they're lying about this, then what else are they lying about?
I think those young people like Bella Fitzpatrick, I think there's probably an element of that going on with them as well. It's like, well, if what I was doing was wrong, I wouldn't be getting 5 million in 3 years from the commission. You know what I mean? And in a way, that's sort of correct. It's like, look at this artifice we've built up. Like, all of this has to be real. Look how good the fucking hors d'oeuvres are. Like, this can't be wrong. You know what I mean? Like it's cruising along on this like air of legitimacy, but you can't poke it, because the minute you poke it, the whole thing falls down. So that's why you'll never get a trans activist on your show. You'll never get anything except bland platitudes from the commission or from the institutions or whatever. I mean, honestly, when you say that about Spain, that really frightens me, because I always just think like the radical feminists in Spain are really strong and hardcore, but I mean, you're a little bit fucked over there, aren't you? Like, it's just too late almost.
Yeah, that the radical feminists are very strong, and it gives the lie to this idea that all the opposition to this comes from the right, because really the only people who are speaking up about it are radical feminists in Spain. And there's there's the kind of right wing manosphere, and there's of course there's Vox, the far right party, and whatever. But actually, they don't really talk about it that much. The manosphere guys are more kind of anti-feminism in general. They're more kind of like women have got too many rights and whatever. And Vox, they're only interested in it when it suits, a particular moment, like if something comes up that they can use as an issue to get some publicity or something. But they're not really interested in changing the system and getting this stuff out of education in the way that the feminists are. It's really hard, but I don't know.
But the thing is, like, and again, as been said a million times before, like this is gonna cause an extreme reactionary right-wing backlash, and it's already happening. And the manosphere is going to start making as much sense as the Iglio people do. You know what I mean? Like, they're all nutcases as far as I'm concerned. And I think the pendulum is going to swing so far back, and you're going to lose things like essential access to abortion and all this stuff. I don't know what Spain's going to do. I feel more hopeful for Ireland. Belgium is as bad or worse as Spain, so forget about it. But also Belgium is a bit of a follower in some ways. But Ireland, I have a feeling like I wish I could move back there, because I feel like our politicians are much more of a pushover than. We don't have very scary activists like you do on the continent. I know Spanish and French and Belgian Antifa types are very militant and very scary. But yeah, anyway.
Anyway, we really should leave it.
Sorry, I can't stop talking once I start.
No, neither can I. I really wanted to do the whole debrief with you after going to that conference, because so much of it just kind of blew my mind, and it's really good to get your comments on it. So yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on. We are going to post this, as we said, on both Substacks. So Roisin's Substack is Pete, and if you are not already subscribed to that, go and do it. And mine is called Gender Looper. It's just a little one, quite new. This will be episode 6, I think. And what we do at Gender Looper is try and just talk about the gender stuff in Spain in English. So if that's something that interests you.
An essential resource. Well done for that, because I think it was really, really necessary.
Well, we're getting there. There might be some written pieces coming up. Summer is a difficult time to get anything done, but bit by bit, we'll build up a bit of a resource there. So usually at the end, I ask guests if there's anything they've changed their mind about that's not gender related, anything just completely off the topic of gender, to show that we do have some kind of life outside of this world.
Something that I've changed my mind about. Well, because you asked me to think of something, and actually I could only think of a gender thing, because it's a point I want to make. I actually piqued someone in work yesterday, but she was still on the pronoun train, and I said to her, and I got it down quite concisely, so this might be useful to some of your readers or your listeners. Don't help men hide the fact that they're men. Using pronouns helps men hide the fact that they're men. And if you care anything about gender-based violence or about predators or anything like that, pretending a man, because a lot of this is a paper-based deception, as Helen Joyce has said. Like, we interact with a lot of people, not in real life, but on paper and on the internet. And so an F where an M should be is just, it's just not a good idea to let men do that, because the absolute worst men are going to be the ones who are going to insist on doing that. So what I changed my mind about was I used to think, like, even if, well, I suppose it was quite a long time ago, but I used to do the pronoun thing at the very beginning because I thought it was polite. But now, no, I don't. And if anyone is looking for a very quick and concise reason not to, say, because it allows men hide the fact that they're men, and if you care about women and kids' safety, then you shouldn't do it. So sorry, I couldn't think of anything non-gender related, but I'm a bit gender addled.
No, I couldn't agree more about that. I mean, with the pronouns, you can't talk about what you're talking about. So if you want to talk about men and women's category in sport, if you say she's excluded because she's trans, then you're just not able to explain what you're talking about. It has to be he's excluded because he's male.
But we have to be patient. We have to be patient with people, I think, who are new, and then you just go, yeah. And when the time is right, you can sort of explain, in a very calm way, like why the good reasons why not to do it. But I think that's sort of the newbies and normies, they kind of hang on to that, don't they? Say, I want to be polite to people to their face. And so we have to be nice and patient with them, I think is the thing.
No, I'm not a pronoun enforcer in either direction. And you do sometimes have to be strategic about it, because otherwise you don't get a hearing at all. But anyway, Roisin, that was great to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on. And, maybe you come back another day and talk about more European stuff, because there's a whole list of things we could talk about.
I would love to. Yeah. Thank you. Ciao.
Bye. Wow, that was a long one. So well done for making it to the end. If you're new here, subscribe to the Gender Lupa Substack to hear more about what's going on with gender in Spain. It's Lupa spelt the Spanish way, L-U-P-A, so genderlupa.substack.com. And for my Gender Lupa listeners, if you're not already subscribed to Roisin's Substack Pete, I suggest you correct that immediately. There's a link in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening. There'll be new episodes of Gender Lupa in the autumn. Until then, have a great summer.